Paris Perspective.
Welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective, where today we're going to look at the crisis in Afghanistan. And today I'm joined in studio by geopolitical strategist and author Gérard Chaliand, who joins me today. And we're going to look at exactly the implications of the failure of the US and Western allies' occupation of Afghanistan over the past 20 years. Now, the lightning takeover of Afghanistan and the capture of Kabul by the Taliban in mid-August jolted a world preoccupied by the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccination distribution, and economic reconstruction. Now, this brought back to the fore the stark reality of what happens when a failed military intervention comes to an abrupt end with no exit strategy. Harrowing scenes of desperate Afghans clinging to the wheels of US military transport planes taking off from Kabul's international airport were described by a human rights lawyer who has worked 13 years in the country as Saigon on steroids. The war on terror, announced by US President George W. Bush in the wake of the 9/11 attacks 20 years ago, has failed. So, what next for the jihadist movements around the world who are celebrating this defeat of the United States? These jihadist movements that are from Mozambique to northern Nigeria, Yemen to Somalia. And what's the next step for rival powers such as Russia, China, or Iran? So, over to you, Gérard Chaliand. Let's have a look at what has happened. Back in 2001, the Taliban of 20 years ago and the Taliban of 2021. There's no such thing as a soft Taliban. But what has changed? What has changed? Is there understanding of new technology, of media, of public relations? Has that really advanced the Taliban in any way?
Well, it's a real metamorphosis, in fact. I have known those who were called the Mujahideen in 80, 81, 82. They were courageous, but extremely primitive, no sense of organization. And it should be said and stressed that Pakistan has been absolutely instrumental in giving them a solid formation. Mm-hmm. They sent those guys, students, that's what it means for Taliban,
sure,
to Deobandi Madrasa, who are hard Sunni style. They trained them, they organized them, and they gave them advice. In other words, Pakistan was receiving a lot of economic help from the US, and ISI, which is their special service, was giving part of that money to the Taliban. In other words, they have learned a lot. I mean, between the Taliban of 2001 and those of yesterday or today, there's a world, absolutely. In other words, they now know how to fight politically, not just
physically,
technically.
Technically, yeah.
They have studied. They just have worked like Maoists, apart from the ideology. In other words, it's the conquest of villages by explaining who we fight, why we fight. We are explaining that we are fighting against a foreign occupation, which is backing a government which is highly incompetent, highly corrupt, and totally inefficient. And it works, of course.
Now, the whole thing, though, the crux of the matter is jihadists are essentially disparate groups. Now, the Taliban have regrouped many people with maybe conflicting interests, one could say. But you are saying that they have become much more slick, etc. But nation building is a different thing. What about their government? Surely the whole construction of a new Taliban state is going to be the biggest challenge facing them because they are now in control. They have now become the mainstream.
That will be very tough. I mean, in a way, it's easier to fight than to build. This business of nation building was total failure for the US. But I'm not sure that they are going to be successful because they are conflicting interest. And at the end, there is one thing for any revolution. Either you take power and then you will deceive most of the population, or you will be able to make the only important thing, growth, economic growth. China has been doing economic growth. Taiwan has been doing economic growth. South Korea has been doing economic growth. Vietnam is doing economic growth. Okay, and what about most of the other so-called revolutions? Failures, dictatorship, despotic states where you just have a little group of people pocketing the money and no change, no middle class. Well, if you can't have economic growth, you have failed. And nobody can say that the Taliban are going to be able to make it.
Now, do you think that if Afghanistan, as it stands now, is running headlong into a civil war? We saw with the attack on Kabul airport there in the past 10 days that was claimed by ISIS-K, that's ISIS Khorasan, which is an affiliate of the Islamic State armed group that surfaced out of Pakistan in 2015. Now, these guys are arch enemies. To my knowledge, they only really came under the radar of Western media in the past 10 days. But you also have the progeny of the Mujahideen commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud, who are holding out, as they have done, I think, for decades, if not centuries, in the Panjshir Valley. So are we looking at an inevitable clash between resistance fighters, between ISK and the Taliban, and maybe other factions who are going to vie for power at the top?
Well, it won't be simple, of course. It's very difficult to say in advance. I mean, what's going to happen? There are going to be clashes, but I mean, civil war, I'm not sure. Why? First of all, I mean, this frontier business is marginal. Honestly, if the name of Massoud was not there as a sort of symbol, we would hardly talk about it. As far as IS is concerned, they hit the right target with 3 suicide bombers. That's all. But psychologically, it's enormous.
Yes.
Everybody has seen that they don't control the situation and that it means something. But controlling the country is another problem. In other words, today the Taliban are the masters. The question is, are they going to be coherent enough, with enough cohesion among them, so that there is no wings and problems among them? Otherwise, I think that IS still is marginal. They will get some help from outside. But the country, and that was the calculus of the Russians. You know that the Russians have been helping the Taliban for the last 4 or 5 years. Their calculus was very simple. Taliban are nationalists, and the jihadists are internationalists. So you want, of course, the nationalists to win. You don't want trouble in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. Same thing for the Chinese. The Chinese do not want guys who are going to help the Uzbek. The
Uyghur.
The Uyghur, yes. And, well, nobody wishes that, in fact, except maybe Pakistanis.
Indeed. And talking of Pakistan, I mean, we all talk about the porous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's, I think, 1.5 million Afghans living in Pakistan. There's between the border between Baluchistan and Pakistan, and it's Kordofan, I think it is, that they join together. Like this porous border, we're talking about this. How is this going to play in the regional politics of, say, Pakistan, Imran Khan, versus the arch rival Narendra Modi in India, when this is really, you've got two nuclear powers who have this big problem state that there is a huge power vacuum where you have China, you've got Russia, potentially Turkey, potentially Iran, all looking at. How is this going to play with the regional nuclear powers?
Well, when you are nuclear, you are, in other words, sanctuarized. Okay. But you're not going to use your nuclear power. Okay. That's the rule of the game up to now.
Mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. So that's why we behave reasonably. I think that the winners are by far the Pakistanis. For them, it's a total victory. I mean, their prime minister just said the fall of Kabul is the end of slavery. Fantastic. You imagine that? I mean, 10 years ago, he couldn't have that kind of language.
Very strong rhetoric.
Very strong. For the Indians, it's a big defeat. They have spent a lot of money in infrastructure. They have trained a lot of people. In other words, Mr. Modi was an ultra-nationalist who took off the autonomy of Kashmir. In other words, he is tickling very badly the Pakistanis.
By revoking the special status of Kashmir, that's right.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, Mr. Nehru was wise enough by telling that, okay, Kashmir will not be really autonomous, but no Indian can buy land. In other words, we are so many that in a few years we could completely overcome demographically the Kashmiris. Now he will try that. And that will, of course, give a lot of incentive for the jihadists to say that, look, I mean, that is what is happening to us. It's not only jihad, it's just survival for us. In other words, the tensions are going to be real. Pakistanis and Indians will not fight. They will fight by proxies. And let's see what the Turks are going to do in this business. The Turks are extremely, I would say, ubiquitous. In other words, they are a member of NATO, but at the same time, they do things that NATO do not like.
Buying weapons from Russia, for example.
Yes, the famous SS-400. But on the other hand, as they are intelligent, Mr. Erdogan is a remarkable tactician. They give drones and weapons to the Ukrainians, which of course is very good for Washington. So in other words, they do a job that the Americans are not doing, but exactly the same thing. So they play all the cards at the same time, and up to now, without mistake.
Yes.
They are important in the Middle East. They are important in Africa. They are important until Afghanistan. And they play everything at the same time. Though, economically, they're weak. Though there is no investment going. In other words, Mr. Erdogan plays the same role as Mr. Putin. He puts everything on its military capacity, and he is that very good, but he is poor, in fact.
And speaking of money, can you maybe give a little overview of how instrumental the Haqqani organized crime network has been in bringing the Taliban to power over the last weeks, months, in the lead up to the fall of Kabul in the past week or so? And the Haqqani network, can you explain exactly what that is? And it also funds ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other affiliates who may be even fighting off each other. So,
yeah, the Haqqani are people who fought against the U.S. occupation. They were very well organized. They are extremists. In other words, they played an important role in I would say, the radicalization of the Taliban.
But they claim to be non-affiliated, isn't that right?
No, they are not. They are in contact with both sides.
Yeah.
And it's hard to measure exactly how influential they can be. But they have a strength by themselves. They are organized. They're tough. One has to watch what the Haqqanis are going to do, choose, etc. They are not the main force, but they are very, very efficient.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've been kind of avoiding the elephant in the room. Let's look at the US allies and closest allies, of course, and that would have been Europe when engaging in Afghanistan post 9/11 in 2001. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, their first response to the Taliban takeover was to call for a united European plan to manage a massive influx of migrants from Afghanistan. This, of course, is fearing a repeat of what happened back in 2015 from Syria and the Islamic State armed group control or takeover of that country, or pockets of the country, and in Iraq. Now, some saw this first response from Macron and Merkel as quite cynical, in light of the desperate images that people were seeing taking off from Kabul and falling to their deaths from planes in midair. But of course, Macron must serenade the right, the far right, here in France ahead of 2022. So do you believe that Europe is looking at what is happening in Afghanistan, particularly France and Germany, as a political tool that needs to be maneuvered properly to keep them in power?
Well, everybody is interested to not be criticized about the way they look to immigration. Immigration is an important problem. And with the populism which is going on in Europe these days, you will not be re-elected if you miss the point. So, first of all, let's say that the truth is that most of the Afghans who wanted to get out of the country will be remaining in the country because there's no way they get out. So, that sort of surge of enormous waves of Afghan refugees in Europe is just a tool, a political tool. That's all. It will not happen.
Also because of logistically and because of the distance, the geographic distance.
First of all, logistically, there's no plane for them. Tomorrow, the country is Taliban. No plane will get out without their consent. Two, they control all the roads to get out of the country. So, in other words, if you want to evade because you have been working with the foreigners, that's very tough. The Taliban will decide, in fact, if they want people to get out or not. And their interest is not to let people get out. A, the collaborators, they don't want them out. B, their technicians, who might be very useful for the state, for the industry, etc., they want to keep them. So in other words, I mean, this is more a political problem than a real pressure of
migrant influx.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, indeed, speaking of politics, despite the symbolism, is this the beginning of the end to US-led Western hegemony on world policing in the name of terror prevention? And EU nations at a G7 summit last week held their hands up. They surrendered, said, okay, Joe Biden, he's refusing to extend the August 31st deadline for withdrawal. This was very much the US calling the shots. How do you think that this withdrawal will affect US and European relations that were, of course, expected to improve after 4 years of Donald Trump and his anger and vitriol against his old allies?
Well, in fact, with another vocabulary and another style, Mr. Joe Biden is doing what is good for America first.
So he's using the Trump slogan, but in a different way.
Exactly. He doesn't ask anything from the Europeans because he knows that they are not strong enough to be really influential on Afghanistan. So he decides alone. He doesn't humiliate openly, but in fact, he does his job. As far as the Europeans are concerned, one has to say that after 60 years of construction of Europe, we have lost Britain. We were important because when you're 28 or 27, that have to decide all together its importance.
Yes.
Its importance. There should have been another thing saying that 2/3 is enough. B, as far as common security, we do not have. And worse, a common defense, which was supposedly one of the aim, we have nothing.
Yes.
We have nothing. In fact, if the US, I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, if the US was not there, the Turks could be in Vienna. Who would stop them?
Yeah.
Bulgaria? Romania? Austria? Okay, I mean, the world has changed.
Indeed, it's a paradigm shift. So indeed, looking back here on French soil, what lessons will France be taking away from this? Especially as President Macron, he said that he was going to be scaling down and eventually putting an end to the Operation Barkhane. That's the anti-jihadist fight that has been going on since 2014 in the Sahel. Surely this changes everything.
He's right to scale down. The fact that we have been long to discover is that this kind of irregular warfare cannot be won. It started with the Indochina War. It was followed by the Vietnam War by the US, that the US was sure to win when they started, saying that, well, the French have been beaten, but I mean, we have helicopters. We are so much more powerful. We'll do the job. Finally, they lost 53,000 people, something that now is unthinkable. Now when we lose, for instance, the French, 5 men, it's a tragedy. Yeah. You've got to bring those guys at the Invalides or whatever. The head of state is to go there saying that they have been victims. No, they have not been victims. They have been just shot or killed in action.
Yes.
Point blank. So this type of war is unwinnable because it's asymmetric, as it said, but the real asymmetry is ideological. If I'm ready to die, and you're just ready to fight because you want to pay your mortgage or get your green card, there is a large difference.
This brings me to my concluding point, Gérard. So, am I right in saying, unless foreign intervention in countries is deemed to be like that, unless foreign intervention in countries that are deemed to be terrorist havens, unless they can ensure a stable, transparent and corruption-free administration, which is hard even in Western liberal democracy to maintain, does that mean that any military intervention alone will never succeed? Let's just call it this. If the current international interventionist playbook is not revised or changed, the jihadists and the revolutionaries will eventually always win.
No, we can hit and go back. In other words, We can still be extremely efficient. The important thing is not to get inside and believe that we're going to make nation building, change the things, and that's blah blah. We know it now, and but we're not finished. We're not finished. The U.S. is still the number one. Okay, it's not the total hegemony that they thought they had in the 90s. Things do change. We have had the crisis of 2008-9, very bad. In 2010, we have been told, hey, China is number 2. That's who expected that in 91. So in other words, the world is changing, the balance is changing. Europe, which has been in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the center of the crisis, today is not at all, the center of anything. The center of the crisis, as you know, is Indo-Pacific. Mm-hmm. So that has changed also.
South China Sea.
Exactly. So the real contest is between the U.S. and its allies and China on the other end. And Europe is still economically very important, but our weight is militarily finished. We should admit that we are declassified.
Yes, we're no longer the powerhouse that used to be, and we're no longer essential in the fight.
Exactly.
Gérard Chaliand, geostrategist and author, thank you very much for being on Paris Perspective today.
Thanks, I enjoyed it.
And thank you very much for joining us on Paris Perspective. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time.